to welcome you to our July Race and Education webinar focused on accessibility for all, meeting the needs of exceptional students of color specifically. And for those of you who don't know, the Hunt Institute is committed to having honest conversations about issues around race, culture, that are embedded in and impact all of our education. We see educational diversity as a through line for all the conversations that we're having. And so this conversation is no different. Our webinar series, Focus on Race and Education specifically, is an opportunity that we see it to provide access to people, organizations who are committed to improving educational outcomes for marginalized and underserved populations in the US. And the panel we have today are the exact people who we want to highlight, and their expertise is second to none. So I'm excited for that conversation and the insight that I'm going to get from listening to them, and also that they'll be able to get from you, will be able to get from them as well. And so to kind of frame this conversation, I want to root us in some data, right? So as many of you probably know, there are about 7.3 million students with disabilities or exceptionalities who are currently enrolled in our public K-12 schools across the country. Now, under IDEA, or Individual with Disabilities Education Act, students with disabilities are guaranteed the right to free and public education. That sounds wonderful. However, special education programs are underfunded, often understaffed, and students of color with disabilities are often disproportionately impacted by those lack of resources. So this conversation will really focus on the extra barriers that particularly students of colors with disabilities face. And the exciting part of the conversation is really identifying some sustainable solutions to help eliminate those gaps in the services for all students with disabilities. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn over to this amazing panel, moderated by Aaron Stark of New School Venture Fund and featuring Dr. Brian Boyd, the William C. Friday Distinguished Professor of Education at UNC Chapel Hill, and my good friend and colleague, Dr. Aseret Dokubo, who is a Chief of Program Quality at Special Education Leadership Fellowship, for what we know will be an enlightening conversation. So with that, I'll kick it over to Aaron.
Hi, thank you, Jarvis. I'm excited for this conversation today, and I just want to thank the Hunt Institute for having this conversation and for inviting new schools at the table to talk to Dr. Boyd and Dr. DeCubo today. So, Dr. Boyd, I want to start with you. First, I'll introduce you to our audience, and then I will follow up with a question. So Dr. Boyd, as Jarvis mentioned, is the William C. Friday Distinguished Professor in the UNC School of Education and the interim director of the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He was previously the director of the Juniper Gardens Children's Project at the University of Kansas. Dr. Boyd is engaged in research that involves the most vulnerable and often marginalized populations. As a special educator by training, much of his research has involved the development and evaluation of evidence-based practices that could be implemented within school and home contexts. His more recent work has focused on how issues of implicit bias and race affect the outcome of children with and without disabilities. Boyd's research has been continuously funded by the federal agencies such as the Institute of Education Sciences and the National Institute of Health. He's the past vice president of the International Society for Autism Research, and he also serves on multiple national boards that are dedicated to improving the outcomes of autistic persons and those from historically underserved communities. Dr. Boyd, given your extensive career, I'd love to hear a little bit more about why this issue is not only personal to you, but central to the work you are doing.
Well, thank you for the question, Aaron, for the introduction, and also a thank you to the Hunt Institute for sponsoring this important conversation, hosting this important conversation. And I'm glad to be a part of it. So as you said in your intro of me, my training is a special education with a focus on early childhood special education, so young children. So I did a lot of direct service work and teaching of, in particular, preschool age children, a lot of them who have learning differences and developmental disabilities. But one story that sort of stuck with me and made me realize that children of color were sometimes having a different experience, actually didn't occur in the classroom, but during a research study that I was involved in. I was leading a parent support group for parents of children with autism, and we were having a conversation around behavior management strategies for their children. And this particular group just happened to be made up of around 4 or 5 white mothers of young children with autism and 1 Black father. And they were talking about some of the behavioral concerns they were having with their children. And I was providing strategies as part of this group. And the Black father shared with me a story I had heard from other parents. And he just shared that, when he took his son to a store, his son thought he would get something new. He associated stores with new toys, which a lot of kids do. And one common behavioral strategy is to recommend you have the child, have the parent carry something with them to a store so the child could hold that, so that they wouldn't think they would get a new toy every time they went in the store. And the dad stopped and he looked up at me and he said, you know, I can't do that because they'll think I stole it. And I thought, oh, wow. I do know what you're talking about. I am a Black man in America who has had that experience of being followed in stores. But I think he was comfortable saying that to me because I was also a Black male in that situation. And we know there are lots of issues around our teaching workforce and sort of the differences and sort of the workforce and sort of the racial ethnic makeup of the workforce versus the children that are showing up in classrooms. But that story stuck with me, and it led to some of the research I'm currently doing around the intersection of race and disability, both from the aspects of risk and resilience. So how the issues of racism and poverty impact children and families of color, but also what are the cultural assets and wealth that families bring to the table. Some of the data we have is that Black families who have larger social networks, have more trusted community members, more family members that are in their network and are supportive to them, feel more empowered. And obviously, when families feel more empowered, they're more likely to be engaged in their children's schooling and parenting. So we know that this work is important. And certainly that story has influenced some of what I've been doing. And so for that story really stuck with me and has certainly continued to inform the kind of research that I'm doing. So.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd, and for giving us such a concrete example of how the disability community is not a monolith, and that the lived experiences are all very individual within that community, and there's more to be understood. Dr. DeCubo, I'd love to do the same, take a moment to introduce you and ask you the same question. So Dr. DeCubo is the Managing Director of Special Education Leadership Fellowship Program, otherwise known as SELF. In this capacity, she's responsible for overseeing the design and delivery of programming for SELF's teacher and leader fellowships. She has extensive experience working with educators and school teams implementing trauma-informed practices along the entire continuum of services. Specifically, she's passionate about disrupting the school to prison pipeline. She has a master's in education leadership from Louisiana State University and a doctorate of education from Johns Hopkins University. So again, I'd love to hear a little bit why this issue is not only personal to you, but central to the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Erin, for the question. Again, thank you to the Hunt Institute for hosting and having me, and hello to everyone out there. I have a story of when I was an educator. So similar to that personal story like a Dr. Boyd shared, but from when I was working at a school. And so again, disrupting the school to prison pipeline has become really personal to me. And it's really part of some of the work I do at SELF. And it's because I have, from my own experience, have shown some biases and assumptions that are often made about students of color who are labeled with a disability. And specifically, I think about my former student, Tyrese. And so he entered as a new student in 6th grade at our school. And the first thing we learned about him, we got the record, the list of new students, we saw he had a disability of emotional disturbance. And so before we even met Tyrese or his family, or even looked at the IEP, evaluation, old records, we already were making contingency plans for his behavior and what would happen if he blew up at school, or what would happen if this happened at school. And so this prejudgment is really, I think, a reflection of the systemic biases and issues that students of colors with disabilities do face. Luckily, that's the year that Tyrese did enroll at our school, we were actually piloting a behavior resource classroom. And so it wasn't a permanent placement for students with behavior disabilities, but a much more like flexible environment, fluid, had a chance students to work on self-regulation and executive function skills and practice and mindfulness, and also get like academic support. And during this year we had this program, Tyrese did so well. His GPA increased. He had a lot like less missing assignments. He spent more time in the classroom instead of being out of the classroom, and just really thrived. However, the following year, a new teacher led that program and they were able to provide some of those same supports, but also some different ones. The year after that, 8th grade, same thing, like similar supports, but different. Then Tyrese went to high school. He had new peers, new teachers who, again, had like some supports with the behavior planners, IEP, but then also introduced new ideas and new strategies. And it was really, I believe, this inconsistent implementation of his supports and the transitions from one teacher to another and one school to another, that led to some increased behaviors inside and outside of school. And I always share about Tyrese in the story is that he was one of 7 boys, like right in the middle, number 4. And he was an amazing brother. And he ended up actually being responsible for taking care of his 3 younger siblings before and after school every day so that his mom could go to work. So this also meant that he had a lot of unsupervised time at home. And I won't go into all the details, but Tyrese ended up spending some time in the juvenile detention center, was released, rearrested, released. So at the age of 16, he essentially missed his freshman, sophomore years of high school. Went back into like the public school system for his junior year where he frequently skipped classes. And ultimately, Tyrese was arrested for a serious crime and he's now serving like a long prison sentence. And so from his story, and I still am actually in touch with him and his family, but I saw how the schools failed him, but like not because of a lack of effort, but this lack of like the coordinated effort of all the parties involved, from family to teachers to leaders, from one school to the next. And so at SELF, we are really dedicated to like not only like some specific contents around trauma-informed practices and universal design for learning, we also want to make sure we can address like what are the root causes of behavioral issues and how can teachers and leaders support the holistic development of like every student and that whole child. And we really have seen that by like giving educators and leaders the skills, knowledge, tools to provide that consistent, coordinated support. We hopefully can prevent more stories like Tyrese from happening. And so that issue again is really central to a lot of the work we do at SELF, because we do believe like one of our values is belief, and we believe that every student deserves the opportunity to reach their fullest potential.
Thank you. That was actually a perfect cue up for the next question. Your example really dove into the complexities that our young people face in and outside of school that we may or may not be aware of, but then also the complexity of preparing educators to support those young people. So Dr. Boyd, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about, in your current role, you not only shape the next generation of special educators, but you also contribute to leading research. Can you tell us about the complexities the next generation of students and educators will face?
Yeah, what a great question, Erin. I think, as we know, for all of us, the pandemic changed everything likely forever. It certainly exacerbated teacher workforce shortages, teacher turnover issues. And we know that teacher turnover and workforce shortages were already more impacting the special education workforce and schools with higher concentrations of families who live in poverty and families with higher concentrations of racially, ethnically minoritized children, even before the pandemic, and has only made it worse since the pandemic. And so that's certainly one issue that the future generation will continue to face. I think we're still grappling with how to rebuild the teaching workforce and how to really attract and retain teachers. I think the other thing it really made us realize is the lack of emotional and social support we provide to teachers, and the importance of teacher mental health in general, that we need to make sure that they are in the mental space and are being well taken care of in order to support children. So I think thinking more about the conditions under which teachers are working and having to do their work is something that we're really thinking about more, that I think will be something that future teachers will impact future teachers as well. The other issue is just the increased privatization of education and school choice. And I don't do research in this space, so I'm not going to say if it's good or bad. I'm just going to say it's certainly an issue that future teachers will continue to face. I don't think we're going back. I think we'll continue to see that issue impact educators. So I think those issues around teacher shortages, teacher workforce issues, teacher mental health, and the continued privatization of education will be some issues that future teachers continue to face.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd. I appreciate your call out of, adult mental health is just as important as the mental health of our youth. Which leads me to the next question. Dr. Takubo, as SELF prepares to build leaders that create welcoming and effective communities that enable all students to achieve their fullest potential, how do you ensure that leaders are being trained to collaborate with the communities they serve, the families they serve, to build partnerships, and that staff are prepared to really help students with disabilities receive the care that they deserve while they're at school and outside of school?
Yeah, Erin, thanks for that question. So I mentioned earlier, one of our values at SELF is belief. Our other two values are responsibility and teamwork. And so we really think about that with responsibility is that like we as educators and leaders are really recognize that it's our responsibility to find those like innovative solutions for challenges. And then with teamwork, making sure that we are prioritizing teamwork and collaboration to build like strong partnerships with, again, not only families and caregivers, but also community partners. And so our core programming really requires that our leaders are continuously being reflective on like, how are they collaborating with, again, all these different parties? How are they leveraging these different perspectives when they make decisions and not making those decisions in isolation or just like with a small number of people providing input? Within our flagship leader fellowship program, we actually offer a comprehensive session on topics such as we call them academic parent teacher teams. And so with this training, we really emphasize like how important it is to, again, involve families and caregivers in the IEP process. Because we know that research has shown that with, family partnership is most effective and like most engaging when it is like learning focused, very like individualized to the students, and also accessible where families don't have to visit schools. I think, again, something that Dr. Boyd, a different point around COVID was like, I think because of COVID and having to go virtual and Zoom, that has broken down some of the barriers of bringing families into the school building around the IEP meetings and having to reschedule them or push them. And now we know that families can just as much actively participate in an IEP meeting over Zoom, over the phone, don't have to take off work, don't have to find, caregivers for their other children. And it lets them be much more involved. And then we also stress with our fellowship and with the partners we work with, like how important the culturally responsive approaches are, and just making sure that, again, schools are really welcoming families from that diverse cultural backgrounds that represent the students in their building and not maybe the educators that are actually teaching them. And so we always wanted to have our leaders think about how are they authentically engaging those families, whether it's like through school committees, through volunteer roles, through opportunities to come into the building again, or like be able to talk through teacher conferences in person, over the phone, et cetera. And I think the other key thing we do with our leaders is we have very like personalized one-on-one coaching or team coaching. So in these sessions, we are constantly asking and delving deeper into, again, like what are the collaborative strategies our leaders are using? How are they making sure that they're training and working with the teachers in their buildings to be collaborative, again, with families, caregivers, I think a lot too about related service providers when it comes to the IEP plan, and not just, the special education teacher, but the occupational therapist, the counselor, the social worker, the SLP, all of those people that play just as much an important role. And so that we can make sure that leaders are working with their teachers and teachers and with the students to really make sure children can achieve and like have access to what they need and then achieve at the levels that they can.
Thank you, Dr. Takubo. And I also just want to take a moment to say thank you for your work and the work of SELF. To contextualize that a little bit for the audience, understood.org and NCLD put out some research a few years ago that majority of students with disabilities spend the most of their school day in general education classrooms with general education peers, yet only 17% of teachers feel prepared to support students with mild to moderate disabilities. So the work that SELF does helping to prepare educators to better support students with disabilities are critical in disrupting these outcome cycles for our young people to start to disrupt them and start to create positive outcomes. So I just want to thank you and Self for doing that work. Dr. Boyd, I'd like to ask you a question and to dive a little bit more into the experience of our young people with disabilities who are also impacted by racism and poverty. According to statistics, Black children, particularly Black boys, are consistently identified for special education services at higher rates than their white counterparts. In your work, have you identified any themes or commonalities that might explain why?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was one of the first things I learned as I was entering into special education, in particular, the disproportionate representation of, in particular, Black boys under certain labels like emotional behavioral disturbance. There's ongoing, I will say now in the field, there's some ongoing vigorous debate over the issue of disproportionality, and some studies suggesting it's happening, some other studies suggesting if you control for certain variables, it doesn't show up as much. But I think the central question is one Dr. DeCubo raised, which is, are children really getting the individualized supports and services they need to thrive? And when they do, it can make a big difference. But I think some of the common themes or issues that come up around this issue that may be explaining some of the differences in either identification or outcomes is one, are we using culturally valid and sensitive assessments to identify children? So what are the tools we're using to screen and identify children and make referrals to the special education system? And are they ones that are culturally appropriate for that particular group? So we have an assessment often issue. The other is sometimes are the outcomes that we're measuring. So when we're not seeing progress, are they the right ones? And are they in any way culturally grounded? I'll give you an example. A number of Black students use African-American vernacular English because that's what they're exposed to in their homes. And it's part of sort of the oral language differences that have been identified for many Black students. And in lots of ways, it could be viewed as a cultural strength and the ability of these children to code switch between home and school. There's an article, I do believe, in Scientific American that showed that some Black students are identified as having a speech disorder when they use African-American vernacular English. So again, misidentification based on what should be viewed as a cultural strength that these students are bringing to schools. I think the other is that we know likely that some implicit biases are at play. There was a pretty seminal study, I think, in 2015 done by some researchers at Stanford University, where they had teachers, a racially diverse group of teachers, I will say, view the fictitious records of students. And they gave these students either white or Black sounding names. And they said these students had committed the same two behavioral infractions. Their teachers were much more likely to say that the behavioral infractions of the Black students sort of were indicative of a behavioral pattern, and were much more likely to assign harsher disciplinary consequences to those students with Black sounding names. And part of it was because they were more likely to think that those students were in general just probably troublemakers. They identified them as troublemakers. So issues of implicit bias show up. Issues of our assessment tools and whether they're culturally valid and sensitive show up. And also, what do we think are the right outcomes that we should be measuring where we're not seeing progress and therefore referring children into the special education system? I think some of those issues are the common themes I've seen when we begin to talk about these issues of disproportionate identification and referral to the system. But I think, again, I think it harkens back to, are kids getting the right things they need to not be referred in the first place, right? And I think Dr. DeCubo's example very early on around when a student is getting what they need, they're thriving. And when they aren't, we know it can lead into the school to prison pipeline issue was a great example of that. So.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd. And I'm going to go a little off script here because we did actually get a question from an audience member that was connected to this theme, which was, do you find, and either of you can respond to this, but in your research that Black and Brown students are often mislabeled as emotionally disturbed? Because I think this question is helpful and interesting, Dr. Boyd, because it taps back into, are the right tools being used? Where is bias showing up? is this a misidentification, mislabeling of ED of certain students, something that has come up either in your work that you've had to actively like talk to educators about, or in your research?
Yeah, I can give a very specific example. My own research is I do a lot of research in autism. And what we've commonly found in autism is that Black children tend to be more likely to be misdiagnosed early on. And usually that misdiagnosis is either ADHD or emotional behavioral disturbance when they actually have autism. And so there's this bias around which kids have autism and what autism looks like. So that's just one specific example where we have data where we know Black children are much more likely to be, Black autistic children are much more likely to be misdiagnosed early on, and usually have 2 to 3 incorrect diagnoses before they get the right diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. So we see that, and there are other ways in which it shows up. We also know, I mean, for those of us in the special education field, that a big part of this is parent advocacy sometimes, and which parents are able to advocate and show up in those spaces. And sometimes parents have been able to advocate for different kinds of labels, right, for their children in order for them to receive certain kinds of services and supports. And so we shouldn't downplay the burden sometimes we've put on parents to be able to be put in these positions where they have to advocate for a certain label for their child to get what they need. But yes, we certainly have seen issues of misdiagnosis of emotional behavioral disturbance. In particular, I would say the work we've done with autistic children. So.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd. And I just also want to take a moment to remind folks, please continue to drop those questions in the chat. And we will make sure we get those questions asked of our panel. So Dr. Jakubo, I'd love to shift to you and let's continue on this theme of, you know, how do we take in authentic data when thinking about how to support students, but how is SELF taking the student experience into account as you curate the support and learning opportunities for educators?
Thanks, Erin, for that question. We at SELF, and I think it's always important for me to like name personally for myself is that I have not worked in a school building in 7 years now. And so I say that because I think the farther, for my personal experience, the farther I've gotten removed from like the day-to-day interactions, the easier it is to kind of forget that day-to-day grind and feeling as a teacher or a leader and be like, I think to work with leaders to be like, you should do this and this and this and this. And they're like, yes, I should, but like, how do I have the time and all? So I just want to name that I have not been in the school building for that many years. But because of that, one of the things that we prioritize to understand student experiences is reincorporate through all of our either programs or technical assistant contracts, walkthroughs and school reviews, so that we are in the building for an entire day, multiple times for the year to really get clear insights and see what is happening in classrooms, in the hallway. What are the interactions looking like between peers, between teachers, teachers and students? And so by observing the classrooms, gathering that data firsthand, then I think not only do we understand like the experience of students, we then can like use that data authentically. And so we try to do a lot of work like using that data that we've collected to then tailor not only the next training sessions and coaching supports we give to the leaders we work with, but then also think more holistically about our programming we offer. And so just a quick example, this past year, again, SELF works primarily like 4 urban cities, so New Orleans, Denver, DC, and Los Angeles. And so across the school reviews and walkthroughs in those various states, we saw a trend that there was a lot of inconsistent either processes or implementation of multi-tiered systems of supports or MTSS for both academics and behaviors, and especially at like the tier 1 general education classroom level, where to what you shared, Erin, earlier about the study done with understood.org and NCLD. So many students are receiving, so many students with IEPs are receiving their education in that general education inclusion classroom. But this tier 1 instruction that we saw this year was like not accessible for most of those students. So long story short, because of that, we've actually shifted our focus of our topics this year to be a lot more focused on how our schools building MTSS structures authentically. And like, again, how are they starting small and doing like one little thing at a time than another, instead of like rolling out a whole top down, bottom, 100% everything. We know it's not realistic to do that authentically in the first year. But those walkthroughs really give us an understanding of what's going on with students. And then the other thing to help us, like once we kind of know that, we always are modeling in our training sessions and then also talking with leaders and educators about universal design for learning and how are they providing that access points and the choice in classrooms, so that students can demonstrate their learning in a variety of ways, that students have the choice of how they interact with lessons, how they're taking information. And it's not all, at least how it was 10 years ago when I first started teaching was just like worksheet, pencil, writing that down. We started doing some computer lessons and everyone's doing computer lessons. And that works great for some people we saw during COVID and also not great for other students. So really thinking about what are the options educators are being able to give students so that students can kind of learn what works for them and then pick and select that. So those are kind of the two, I think, key ways we're really trying to look at student experience and then like use that information to tailor the support we provide.
Thank you. I love how you elevated like the need for strong systems, like MTSS systems to have early identification, like warning data. So we don't have to go full on to IEP, but there's a lot of steps we can take in between. And that you're also focusing on tier 1. What can we do to make instruction more accessible for everyone? Yes, this is good for students with disabilities, but this is actually going to be really beneficial for everybody in the classroom. So I'd love to hear from you, Dr. Boyd, given your most recent research on how implicit bias and race affects student outcomes of children with and without disabilities. How can you partner with organizations like SELF to ensure they are addressing issues explicitly about implicit bias in their training and support?
Yeah, I think first I want to acknowledge, I think sometimes when people hear the words implicit bias, it sets off alarm bells, but the reality is we all have biases. It's just very common. In studies of implicit bias, you see that individuals with formal education have just as many implicit biases as those with less formal education. So you see similar levels of implicit bias among physicians and trial judges as you do amongst the general population. So we all have them. They're quite normal to some degree. And so what you find though is that it's not necessarily about changing implicit biases. It's more about changing the attitudes, behaviors, and practices we're using when we're interacting with students of colors. And in this case, the intersection of students of color and disability. And so I think one of the best ways we can partner with organizations like SELF is to help research and expand upon the work they're doing, how do you use trauma-informed practices? How do you really implement tiered systems of support so that they're beneficial and useful and being done in a manner that is equitable to support all students and to prevent those students who should be inappropriately referred for tier 3 services, that we're catching them before they get there, or not sending them there too quickly. So I think it's really sort of elevating the work that organizations like SELF are doing to really put some of those practices into place and acknowledging that biases are likely operating. But what we can do is change the actual practices that people are implementing to maybe mitigate those biases. So the use of culturally responsive pedagogy and practices we know are important, right? And so how are we grounding our work in their use? And so I think those are some of the things we can do. And I just always think the more we can partner with community-based organizations and agencies that are doing work in those communities, the better we'll be in general. And what I've often learned through my work is that a lot of times, organizations, and particularly the organizations within those local communities, have already figured out the solutions to the issue, and we just have to work with them, partner with them as researchers to help them evaluate and study those solutions that they've generated. So I think elevating some of the things that are happening will make a huge difference. So.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd. And Dr. DeCubo, I saw you nodding your head in agreement a lot because I know that's work that SELF does. So I'd love to ask you a question. SELF has supported 1,000 leaders from 7 states with over 350 professional development workshops and learning community activities. How are your alumni leaders engaged to ensure that the support and learning they did with you continue and have a ripple effect?
Yeah, so something, and I wish, I don't have the numbers right off the top of my head right now, but something we're really proud of at Self, and some like our strongest data points is like, one, how many of the educators that have been in our leader fellowship, kind of our flagship program that's been around for year 10 starting this year. One, how many of them continue to work in education to this day, which I don't have to, I would say it's about 85%. So a strong number are still working in schools or in the district level in their roles. But then many of them, because of the positive, not only like knowledge they gain throughout Self, but also like the collective community they built, they then, as they are moving from a special education leader at a school to an assistant principal or to the district level leader, are then putting the new special education leader or their new teacher, or like, you know, their 4th, 5th, 6th year teacher who they see being the special education leader in a couple of years, starting to build that pipeline and is going through our Self program. So we really got to see throughout districts and in smaller school sites, having Self leaders that, and whereas our teachers, special education leaders, now the district level leaders, seeing that pipeline be built, which is just something that we like love to see and are always excited about. And then the other things that we, because of the partnership and community they build together, is we have a very like live and active like alumni, informal but like communication and group where they're sending emails that we have email threads that are like, does anyone have a tool for this thing? Or like, hey, I have a new student with autism and we haven't had support, we haven't had formal supports for that student before. And so what are some tools that you have used? What has worked well? What are ideas? Can you come over and do an observation with me and help me brainstorm? And so a lot of just like informal emails, texts, phone calls. And then also with Self, we also try to make opportunities to like, hey, we got this really great resource. Actually, we sent a ton of stuff out from understood.org. Wanted to share and make sure everyone has access, has eyes on it. Or, hey, there's this really cool free resource at the Friday Institute. Check out their module that they have about learning differences. So kind of use polling resources and making sure that they are continuing to stay up to date. I think most educators, one of their probably core values is love of learning or learning, growth, knowledge. And so being able to like rely on that for them to kind of continue their own support has been great. And then separately, we always offer like technical assistance and support to anyone that wants it. So a lot of times we'll follow up with fellows to do, you know, do you want us to come through and do a walkthrough or review with you this year? So we can, again, see what is actually happening in the classrooms, help you identify what is that goal you have for this school this year. Maybe last year it was focused on academic MTSS systems. Now you want to focus on behavior and trauma-informed practices. Look, let's do an observation, see where you guys are, the baseline, and then let's see what your goal needs to be for this year or for next year. So offering kind of those supports, again, like one-on-one through contracts and like informal check-ins, but also just our alumni community and base and continuing to share resources and now connecting fellows from New Orleans and LA and having them have a conversation and over to DC. I think special education can be sometimes feel lonely because it's I feel like not as much anymore, but you know, can be an island or consist of a smaller community. And so by having our larger Self alumni community across the country, I think it always feels good and bad to be like, oh, that's happening at my school and your school. Like I'm sad it's maybe happening everywhere, but I also feel more comfort. And then now let's put our brains together. How can we both address this and have this look different in our different communities and across the country?
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing up that last point about how isolating the profession can be and the power in building community for shared like empathy building, but also for shared expertise. And that Self is considered a trusted partner to schools and to school leaders. And that is very important, that schools can have trusted partners to do this work and to do it better. I'd love to go ahead and bring in some questions that we have from the audience now. And whichever of you feel called to best answer this question, I will leave it up to you two to figure out, because I don't know your expertise in this area, but the question I'm going to bring into the space is from someone who works with college students with disabilities. And as the audience may or may not know, while students are in K-12, they're protected under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And the core of that is that it's the school's responsibility to identify those students and provide them their supports. Once they leave and they go on to college, they're covered under ADA, the American with Disabilities Act. And it's the young person's or adult's responsibility to self-identify and ask for what they need. So often when our young people with disabilities are transitioning into college, this can be a tricky time for them. So I really appreciate this question from somebody who works with college students with disabilities. They're focusing on childcare programs and have noticed that these programs include children with autism and other students with disabilities. I'd like to know how I can best support educators working with these young people to ensure they receive the best possible care and education. So shifting the lens a little bit from K to 12 to post-secondary, what would you recommend? Dr. DeCubo, do you guys to self-work on some of this with some of the schools that you support, thinking about post-secondary and how to support students?
A little bit. So we do we dabble a little bit with supporting high school leaders with transition planning, then also trying to also talk about transition planning even as far as elementary school and middle school. I was just trying to get, I think, a sense of this question with the child. So it's okay. So still looking at college students, not their children. I was making sure I was reading the question right. I think just what my initial kind of gut response to this is working with the educators. For me, I a little bit of think of self as a little bit such the universal design for learning, but just the idea of what are the options for students to demonstrate their learning. I have not been in a, I guess, undergraduate college classroom in quite some time, but I know from my own prior experience, it was very everyone had to submit the thing the same way, whether that was through a blog post, whether that was through a paper, whether that was through multiple choice tests. It was always the same way for everyone. And if students had maybe accommodations, they would get extra time, or they might have a scribe, but it was still had to be done in the same format. So I think for me, I would say I would work with those educators to think about what is the thing what is the learning goal? What is the thing we really want these students to know? And is there a way that they can do that is different than just a multiple choice test or short answer or essay response? At least at a minimum, I feel how can they use some technology from text to speech and pieces like that to demonstrate their knowledge, or how can they do this in maybe a project format instead of a writing format? So they're just some of I feel the little pieces or things of just how can they demonstrate that learning differently, at least on some of the assignments, knowing that they might have to do the final the same way, and that's I understood it in the college level, but that's kind of my initial suggestion. But also would be curious, Dr. Boyd, what you have working at the college level and UNC and stuff.
Yeah, I think I was trying to wrap my head around the question a little bit, make sure I was answering it correctly. I think part of my answer is a part of what Erin started talking about. I think in particular this age, one of the things we can have educators do is encourage students to become advocates, self-advocates. A lot of students with disabilities don't go to the accessibility office to ask for what they need because of issues of stigma and other kinds of reasons, or they're afraid their professor or educator won't actually implement the accommodation in this space. So supporting students in their self-advocacy efforts, because it's a lifelong skill, and going to the spaces and figuring out and asking for what they need, I think is one of the best things we can work with educators and professors to do, and also then professors to actually implement in those accommodations when they are actually then have been deemed necessary to help that student learn. So.
Thank you. I really appreciate both of those responses. I'm going to read the next question for both of you. But what is your response to people who are educated but not in special education, who travel and speak on the topic that Black children should never be in special education? As the parent of a child, now adult, who is on the autism spectrum, had ADD, and a nonverbal learning disability, I know that is not true. How do we instead teach parents and guardians on what to ask in order to advocate for their children?
I can start there. This is such a good question. I mean, I think this panel is really talking about some of these historical issues, right? We have to recognize that sometimes issues of stigma and labeling have been problematic, in particular in the Black community, that we have to acknowledge. As Dr. DeCubo started off, we also have issues of people being tracked into special education and ending up in the criminal justice system when they have likely a documented disability that was never appropriately dealt with or treated. But I think your question is getting to the issue of when people don't get the services and supports they need, that is just as problematic, right? And so there have been some folks who are anti-special education, and often it's coming from the lens of issues of stigma and labeling, and what does that do to students? But I think of special education is any other field, right? We want people to get the services and supports they need that will help them grow and thrive and learn. And some students do indeed benefit from special education services. And I think of it as, and sometimes it's just the term, and some people get caught up in special education. And really, we're just talking about individualized supports, right? Because we know that we all learn differently. Every one of us learns differently. And so some kids just need more supports and more services in order to help them learn and thrive in a school environment. And so we should all be in support of children getting what they need in order to learn and thrive. And we just, unfortunately, I think in part of what has happened, right, in this country is we've set up a system in which you sometimes need a label to get a service. We know with autism, you often get different kinds of services if you have that label than if you have a different label. And so because we set up now insurance where you get additional services through insurance company if your child has a diagnosis of autism. So we label in order to get access to service, and that's the system we've set up. And sometimes that's problematic because we can mislabel. But until we remake the system itself, what we should be focused on, I think, is getting kids the services and supports they need to learn and thrive, and recognizing that we all learn differently. So that's how I try to approach it. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd. Yes, Dr. DeCool.
Yeah, no, I think the only thing I would add to that, or again, I'm thinking from when I was working in a school and would have parents who would decline, we would send home a request for an evaluation. And so one of the things that I had found personally, just that worked well, or just besides having a conversation, was having parents come into the school building, which I know I had said earlier, that can also, I know, be a barrier to get into it, but to also just kind of see what special education is or looks like. Just because I know my own, I know when I became a special education teacher, I still envisioned it as what I grew up seeing of that classroom, and downstairs, the back hallway, or totally separate. And most places have moved away from that. And again, inclusion is the kind of default for most students. Sorry, I'm thinking placement that they are receiving. And so I think just one to just kind of parents say, what does it mean to be special education? What would a day in the life look like if that was my student? And to see that a lot of times it's having 2 or 3 adults in a classroom providing support to those students in those classrooms. And I think the other thing I was going to say in it, speaking to the person that asked this question, I think it's also sharing kind of the success stories when they are there. Again, I love sharing the story of Tyrese and how great he did the year he had all those individualized supports and a fluid placement where he was in and out of this resource room that we had. And this person that's submitted this question, it seems that they've had a positive experience for them and their children in special education and supports they receive. So I think just trying as much as possible to share those stories, if people can see that students, again, students of color, Black students, Black boys, while there are a lot of things that may have not worked historically well for them in special education and still have room to improve, there's also places we're seeing where it's working really well and they are receiving, are being really successful.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question. I'll go ahead and read this one off, but often PTSD is mistaken for any number of psychological issues: autism, ADHD, disassociation, bipolar, schizophrenia, oppositional defiance. What do the panelists think about the impact of trauma on the disproportionality of the referrals to special education?
I can start just quickly say, I think we haven't always recognized the impact of trauma for students, in particular students from certain marginalized backgrounds, that trauma is likely impacting why they're displaying and showing certain behaviors, right? And so we've often just sort of immediately assigned a label to it, and sort of provided sort of traditional special education services without the added layer of dealing with the underlying trauma that that child or family may be experiencing, that may be contributing to, and sometimes in cases exacerbating symptoms and behaviors, right? And I think so. Yes, I think you can have some cases in which it's really about trauma, and underlying trauma, and dealing with the trauma may decrease some of these issues. You certainly can have, but I also think, I'm not a psychologist, but I also know that this is complicated sometimes to sort out, right? Because you often, and solving issues of trauma are even more complicated for a variety of reasons. We unfortunately can't, pull families out of poverty who may be experiencing that. Or so what can we do to provide supports and services? But I think the answer is yes, and I think we're getting better at recognizing that trauma may be showing up in different ways and impacting behaviors that we're seeing. But I still think we sort of have some issues with sorting that out, and what does it all mean to some degree. So it's not a great answer, but I think we're at least recognizing it more, which is a good thing.
Yeah, I think I would build on that. Or like, I agree that we are definitely, I think, recognizing it more. And I want to just voice that I think it's also really important to consider or think about trauma when it happens to like an entire community, or like, again, entire nation and world. As we went through like the COVID pandemic, although I think, for some people that was more of like an acute traumatic experience. But I worked in a school system where the entire city was affected by a natural disaster that was very extreme. And like, it was 5-10 years after the natural disaster that I was working in that school system. And then we're starting to see like, oh, these students in the third across the city in third, fourth, fifth grade were having high referral numbers. And we were like, oh, they were 1 and 2 and 3 when this natural disaster happened, and they went through all these adverse childhood experiences. And their families did, and like there was no, so I also think it's just going like when it happens at like a wider level, again, what are the community partners that we're really trying to bring in to help families sift through that traumatic experience and talk about it and process it whatever way they need to work for them. But it's not always specific to the school. Sometimes it's like the entire community experience that. So how are we thinking about that as well?
Yeah, I appreciate both of those responses. And I think it brings me back to what you guys were saying earlier about the importance of mental health. And while disability is often identified because a student might not be making the academic progress we would hope, we really have to honor and recognize the connection between mental health and your ability to show up and learn in the ways in which educators are expecting young people to learn. So how are we expanding what we think about as like student success, and really honoring that connection between student wholeness, mental wellness, and that impact on their ability to succeed academically. So I would love to thank you, audience, for these really wonderful questions that provoked like hard questions to answer. No easy questions here. But the work that Dr. DeCubo and Dr. Boyd are doing are helping us to untangle some of that and figure out a better way forward. So I would love to hear from both of you. What leaves you inspired and positive about special education? And what would you say to aspiring educators of color seeking their special education certification?
I can go first this time, Dr. Boyd. I think what leaves me inspired about special education is what like experiencing when it like the positive impact it can have when students are getting all the supports they need. So I think, again, the story of Tyrese, despite the ultimate kind of outcome and challenges, I think really it's a testament to like when you have that coordinated support, when you have individualized support, students can really thrive. They can learn the skills they need, not only academically, but also for that self-regulation and behavior, and can just be really successful. I think for talking to maybe aspiring like educators of color that want to go into special education, which I love and say do it, I'd say like just know how unique and special your perspective and experiences are coming into a field that is, again, a predominantly field of, especially in special education, predominantly white field. So I would say, I think our education system definitely needs more diverse voices and leaders and teachers who can advocate for students that have similar cultural and ethnic backgrounds as them. And so, so do it.
Yeah, great answers. I would sort of echo a lot of that and just say what leaves me inspired always is sort of the families who are part of the system, right? And the impact we hope special education is having for them and their children who are part of it. And so when it works right, as Dr. DeCubo says, it's wonderful when there's a great relationship between the special education teacher and the system and the families and the impact that it truly can have and the success it can and opportunities it can create for children. I would say what I would say to its aspiring teachers of color is find your network, find your support system, and find your support network. It's really can be hard out there, especially when you start, but we know having a great mentor and a great support team, in particular in those first few years of teaching, is really important. So find your support system.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boyd and Dr. DeCubo, for sharing your insights today. I would love to turn it back over to Jarvis to close us out.
Awesome. Well, Aaron, Dr. DeCubo, Dr. Boyd, thank you so much for your incredible insights. Truly just thankful for all the conversation that's so long overdue. I'm glad we can have the conversation, and we look forward to bringing this conversation in person. Sean and I were talking behind the scenes to a neighborhood near many of you soon. With that, I want to invite all of you, one, to definitely look these folks up. They're incredible organizations. Their work is super important, pivotal to for the cause of really supporting students with exceptionalities, right? So please look at all the organizations, New School Venture Fund, the Friday Institute, as well as SELF as well. And then Sean just linked in their chat our next webinar, which is focusing on cultural and linguistic diversity. And the chat is the actual registration link. It's going to be in a few weeks later in August. So we look forward to seeing you there. And again, have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you for joining us. And thank you again to our incredible moderator and panelists. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Bye.